The funeral flowers had barely wilted when my son's hand cracked across my face. "This isn't your home anymore. Mom, get out." Andrew's voice was slurred with alcohol and something darker, a coldness I'd never heard before. Behind him, his wife Sarah stood with her arms crossed, that familiar smirk playing on her lips. She'd been waiting for this moment. We were standing in the living room where my husband Thomas's casket had been just hours earlier. The funeral guests had left, taking their condolences and casseroles with them. I was gathering the last of the memorial cards when Andrew cornered me. "We need to sell this house." "Mom," he'd said, swaying slightly. "Sarah and I have debts. Credit cards are maxed out. This place is worth $500,000. Your father just died." "Andrew," I replied quietly, "can we at least wait until—" "Wait for what? You're 72 years old. You don't need all this space." Sarah stepped forward. "We've already spoken to a realtor. The market's hot right now. We could have this sold in 2 weeks." That's when I understood. This wasn't grief talking. This was a plan they'd been nursing, waiting for Thomas to die so they could cash in. "No," I said firmly. "This is my home. Our home. I'm not selling." That's when Andrew's face twisted with rage. "You ungrateful old woman, we've been taking care of you, letting you live here." "Letting me," the words escaped before I could stop them. "Andrew, I helped buy this house. My name is on the deed." "Not for long," Sarah muttered under her breath. The slap came so fast I didn't see it coming. The force of it sent me stumbling backward into the mantelpiece. My cheek burned, but the betrayal cut deeper. "Pack your things," Andrew said, his voice steady now, as if striking his mother had somehow sobered him. "I want you out by morning." I touched my cheek, feeling the heat spreading across my skin. In that moment, looking at my son, this man I'd raised, sacrificed for, loved unconditionally, I felt something inside me shift. Not break, but harden. "All right," I said quietly. They looked surprised. Maybe they'd expected tears, pleading, or dramatic declarations. Instead, I walked to my bedroom with the same steady pace I'd used for 72 years. I could hear them whispering in the living room, probably planning which rooms to redecorate first. I pulled my old suitcase from the closet, the same one I'd packed for Thomas's hospital stays. As I folded my clothes, my hands were remarkably steady, because while Andrew thought he was throwing me out, I was beginning to remember something important. This house wasn't just his inheritance to claim. It was mine to protect. The next morning, I sat in the small diner downtown, nursing a cup of coffee and letting the memories wash over me. 37 years ago, Thomas and I had stood in this very building when it was still a bank, signing the papers that would make us homeowners. I was 35 then, working as a registered nurse at Mercy General. Thomas had just lost his auto repair business to bankruptcy, and his credit was destroyed. The bank manager had been blunt. "We can't approve a loan based on Mr. Carter's financial history alone." That's when I stepped forward. "What about both our names? I'd been working steady for 15 years. My credit was spotless, my income reliable." The banker's demeanor changed immediately. "Mrs. Carter, with your financial standing as co-borrower, we can certainly work something out." Thomas had been embarrassed, but grateful. "You sure about this? Eileen? It's a big responsibility. We're a team." I'd told him. "We build this together." And we did. For 37 years. We'd paid that mortgage together. When Thomas's new construction business took off in the 90s, we'd celebrated. When it slowed during the 2008 recession, I'd picked up extra shifts to keep us afloat. When he got sick in 2012, I'd worked double time to cover his medical bills and the mortgage. Through it all, both our names stayed on that deed. Equal partners, equal owners. But somewhere along the way, Andrew and Sarah had started acting like the house was already theirs.
It began subtly, Sarah rearranging furniture, repainting rooms without asking, referring to it as our place when talking to friends. Andrew had started making decisions about repairs and renovations without consulting me. Last month, I'd overheard a phone call that should have been a warning. Sarah was talking to someone, saying, "Once the old man goes, we'll figure out how to handle his mother. There are facilities for people like her." I'd convinced myself I'd misunderstood. Now I realized they'd been planning this for months, maybe years. The diner bell chimed, and I looked up to see Jessica Reeves walking in. She worked at First National Bank, the same bank where Thomas and I had signed our original mortgage papers. I'd known her since she was a teenager. Her mother had been my patient during her cancer treatment. "Mrs. Carter," Jessica said, sliding into the booth across from me. "I'm so sorry about Mr. Carter. He was a good man." "Thank you, dear." Jessica hesitated, then leaned forward. "Mrs. Carter, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but your son and his wife came into the bank last week. They were asking about the mortgage account, trying to get information about transferring the title." My coffee cup stopped halfway to my lips. "What did you tell them? That they'd need proper documentation and your signature as co-owner? They seemed surprised that your name was still on everything." Jessica looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Carter, they also asked about your mental competency requirements for property transfers." The coffee turned bitter in my mouth. They hadn't just been planning to sell the house. They'd been researching how to cut me out entirely. "Thank you for telling me," I said quietly. Jessica reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "My mom always said you were the strongest woman she knew. She said you fought for her when the insurance company tried to deny her treatment." After Jessica left, I sat alone with this new understanding. Andrew and Sarah hadn't just insulted me or thrown me out in a moment of grief-fueled anger. They'd been systematically planning to strip me of everything Thomas and I had built together. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated exactly how much I knew about fighting at First National Bank. The morning sun streamed through tall windows as I sat across from the loan officer, a stack of papers spread between us. "Mrs. Carter," the woman said, reviewing my file, "I need to inform you of some unusual activity on your account." My heart rate quickened. "What kind of activity?" "Last week, your son and daughter-in-law requested a complete copy of your mortgage documents. They also inquired about the process for removing a co-borrower due to mental incapacity." The words hit me like ice water. Mental incapacity. They'd actually been researching how to have me declared incompetent. "What did you tell them?" "That any changes to the mortgage or deed would require your consent and signature, plus proper legal documentation. When they asked about alternatives, I referred them to speak with an attorney." I took a deep breath. "And my rights as co-borrower?" "Completely intact. You have full authority over this account, Mrs. Carter. In fact, as the primary income earner when the loan was originated, your signature carries significant weight." I thanked her and left the bank with a new clarity. This wasn't just about hurt feelings or family drama. Andrew and Sarah had been building a legal strategy to steal my home. They thought they were dealing with a confused old woman who didn't understand her own rights. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The law office of Megan Dale occupied the second floor of a restored Victorian building downtown. I'd chosen her carefully, young enough to be sharp, experienced enough to be thorough, and importantly, someone with a reputation for helping older adults protect their assets. "Mrs. Carter," Megan said, reviewing the documents I'd brought, "you have a very strong legal position. As co-owner and co-borrower, you have every right to make unilateral decisions about this property. Even though my husband has passed, especially then, the property doesn't automatically transfer to your son. Based on your current will, He would only inherit your portion upon your death, and even then, only if you choose to leave it to him."
I leaned forward. "What if I don't choose to leave it to him?" Megan smiled grimly. "Then that's your decision to make. But first, let's talk about protecting yourself in the immediate term." Over the next hour, she explained my options. I could suspend mortgage payments, forcing Andrew and Sarah to either take over the full financial responsibility or face foreclosure. I could change my will to protect myself from any future abuse. Most importantly, I could document everything that had happened. "I need you to write down everything you remember about last night," Megan said. "Every word, every action. And going forward, I want you to document any contact they make with you." "What about the house itself?" "You have several options. You could sell it yourself and keep the proceeds. You could rent it out. You could even donate it to a charity for the tax benefits." She paused. "Or you could simply hold on to it and let your son figure out how to manage without you subsidizing his lifestyle." I thought about this. For 37 years, I'd been contributing to that household in one way or another. Even after retirement, my Social Security and pension had helped cover utilities and maintenance. They'd taken my financial contributions for granted while planning to cut me out entirely. "I want to change my will first," I said, "and I want to suspend those mortgage payments." Megan nodded. "I'll draft a new will that includes specific protections against elder abuse, and I'll prepare the paperwork to halt the automatic payments. How long do you want to give them to figure things out? How long does the bank usually allow before foreclosure proceedings? Typically 90 days after the first missed payment." That seems fair. After I left Megan's office, I drove to the small apartment I'd rented across town. It was furnished, clean, and most importantly, mine. For the first time in months, I could walk through a space without wondering if someone was going to criticize my choices or move my belongings. That evening, I started documenting everything. I wrote down every conversation I could remember where Andrew or Sarah had made plans for their house. I noted the dates when they'd gone to the bank, the phone call I'd overheard about putting me in a facility, even the small comments about my mental state. As I wrote, a pattern emerged. This hadn't been a sudden decision triggered by grief. They'd been laying groundwork for months, maybe longer. Every time Sarah had redecorated without asking, every time Andrew had made repairs without consulting me, every time they'd referred to the house as theirs, it had all been part of a larger plan. But plans work both ways. And now I had one too. The first mortgage payment was due on the 15th. On the 16th, I received a call from the bank confirming that automatic payments had been suspended per my request. On the 17th, Andrew called me for the first time since throwing me out. I let it go to voicemail. "Mom, it's Andrew. Look, we got a call from the bank. They said there was a problem with the mortgage payment. Can you call me back? We need to talk." I deleted the message without responding. Over the next week, he called 6 more times. Sarah called twice. I didn't answer any of them. Let them wonder. Let them worry. For too long. I'd been the one carrying the emotional labor of our relationship, always available, always accommodating. Now they could experience what it felt like to be ignored. Instead, I focused on building my new life. I found a part-time job at a medical clinic downtown. They were thrilled to have an experienced nurse, even just for filing and patient intake. I joined a support group for older adults dealing with family conflicts. I rediscovered the library, the museums, the parts of the city I'd neglected while being a full-time caregiver. For the first time in years, my days belonged to me. But I wasn't naive. I knew Andrew and Sarah wouldn't give up easily, which is why I wasn't entirely surprised when my new landlord, Mrs. Chen, knocked on my door with a concerned expression. "Mrs. Carter, there was a man here earlier asking about you. Said he was your son, but he seemed agitated." What did he want? to know if you were acting strangely or seemed confused. I told him you seemed perfectly fine to me, but he kept pressing, asked if I'd noticed any memory problems or unusual behavior. My blood ran cold. They were building a case for mental incompetency. If they could get enough people to question my mental state, they might be able to have me declared unable to manage my own affairs. Did you tell him anything else? Just that you seemed like a lovely, independent woman? But Mrs. Carter, he also asked about your finances, whether you'd seemed worried about money or confused about paying bills. I thanked Mrs. Chen and immediately called Megan. "They're not wasting time," she said after I explained. "This is actually good news for us." "How is that good news?" "Because it shows premeditation. They're not just reacting emotionally to your father's death, they're executing a plan. That makes their actions look calculated rather than sympathetic." She was right. But it also meant I needed to be more careful. I started carrying a small notebook, documenting every interaction, every phone call, every person who mentioned speaking with Andrew or Sarah about me. The documentation proved useful sooner than I expected. 3 weeks after suspending the mortgage payments, I was leaving the grocery store when I spotted a man in a gray sedan who seemed to be watching me. He followed me to the pharmacy, then to the post office. When I deliberately took a circuitous route home, he stayed behind me. I called Megan from my apartment. They hired a private investigator. She confirmed after I described the surveillance. "It's not illegal, but it tells us they're serious about building a case against you." "What kind of case?" "Probably trying to document any behavior they can characterize as erratic or concerning. The fact that they're paying for professional surveillance suggests they're planning something significant." That night, I lay awake thinking about the man in the gray sedan. Somewhere across town, Andrew and Sarah were probably reviewing his reports, looking for anything they could use against me. The thought should have been frightening, but instead, I felt a strange sense of clarity. They thought they were hunting me. But I'd been a nurse for over 30 years. I'd dealt with difficult patients, demanding doctors, life and death situations that required split-second decisions. I'd managed household finances through economic downturns, medical crises, and family emergencies. If they wanted to play games, I was ready. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I got dressed up. Nice clothes, careful makeup, styled hair. Then I drove to the busiest part of downtown and spent the day being as publicly competent as possible. I paid bills at the bank, handled errands at City Hall, had lunch with Jessica from the bank, and made sure we were photographed together looking like old friends. If someone was documenting my behavior, I'd give them something worth documenting. They came on a Thursday evening, just as I was settling in with a cup of tea and a book. The knock was sharp, insistent, Andrew's knock, the same demanding rhythm he'd used as a child when he wanted something immediately. I opened the door to find both of them standing in the hallway. Andrew looked haggard, his usually neat appearance disheveled. Sarah stood behind him, her arms crossed, but I could see the worry in her eyes despite her defiant posture. "Mom," Andrew said, "we need to talk." "Hello, Andrew. Sarah?" I didn't invite them in. "This has gone on long enough," Sarah said, stepping forward. "This whole mortgage thing, it's childish. You're going to lose the house." "No," I said calmly. "You're going to lose the house. I'm protecting myself." Andrew's face reddened. "Protecting yourself from what? We're your family. Family doesn't slap their mother and throw her out of her own home." I was drunk. I was grieving. "You were planning." I pulled out my phone and showed them a photo I'd taken at the bank. "Jessica Reeves told me about your visit. Mental competency evaluations, Andrew research into removing co-borrowers." The color drained from Sarah's face. Andrew opened his mouth, then closed it. "You thought I was just some confused old woman you could manipulate," I continued. You forgot that I was handling complex medical cases before you were born. You forgot that I managed our household finances for decades. You forgot that I'm not as helpless as you convinced yourselves I was." "Mom, please," Andrew said. And for a moment, he sounded like the little boy who used to cry when he skinned his knees. "We can fix this. We made mistakes, but we're family." "Family," I repeated. "Is that what you called it when you researched having me declared mentally incompetent? Is that what you called it when you hired a private investigator to follow me?" Andrew's eyes widened. "How did you—" "Because I'm not as isolated or helpless as you think. I have friends, I have resources, and I have rights." Sarah finally spoke up, her voice tight with desperation. "What do you want?" "Money. We can pay you rent. I want you to understand something," I interrupted. "That house isn't some windfall that fell from the sky. Thomas and I built that life together, brick by brick, payment by payment. My name is on that deed because I earned it. My signature is on that mortgage because I qualified for it, and my decision to protect myself from your greed is mine to make." I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope. "This is my new will. I had it updated last week." Andrew took it with shaking hands. As he read, his face went ashen. "You're leaving everything to charity. I'm leaving everything to people who won't slap me and throw me out of my own home. Mom, you can't—" "I can." And I did. I stepped back toward my door. "You have about 60 days before the bank starts foreclosure proceedings. I suggest you use that time to figure out how you're going to manage without my financial support." "This is insane," Sarah exploded. "You're destroying your own family over a moment of anger." I looked at her calmly. "You destroyed this family when you started planning to steal my home and have me declared incompetent. I'm just protecting myself from thieves who happen to share my DNA." Andrew was still staring at the will. "The house is worth $500,000. "Yes," I said. "It is. And when it's sold, that money will go to organizations that help elderly women who've been abused by their families. Women like me." I closed the door and turned the deadbolt. Through the wood, I could hear them arguing in the hallway. Andrew's voice breaking, Sarah's sharp and angry. Eventually, their voices faded as they walked away. I made myself another cup of tea and returned to my book. For the first time in months, my hands weren't shaking. The second month brought desperation. Andrew called from his office, his workplace, even borrowed phones from friends. When I continued to ignore him, he started showing up at my apartment building. Mrs. Chen had to ask him to leave twice. He tried enlisting allies. His father's brother called, pleading for family unity. Thomas's old business partner stopped by the clinic where I worked, urging me to reconsider for Thomas's sake. Even our old pastor reached out, suggesting family counseling. To each of them, I said the same thing. Ask Andrew about the private investigator he hired to follow me. Ask Sarah about the research she did into having me declared mentally incompetent. Then we can talk about family unity. The story spread quickly through our small community. I'd lived there for nearly 4 decades, built relationships, earned respect. When people learned what Andrew and Sarah had planned, the sympathy shifted decisively in my direction. Meanwhile, the bank's letters grew more urgent. Notice of default in red letters. Foreclosure proceedings to begin. Each envelope that arrived at the house was another step closer to the inevitable. I knew because Jessica kept me informed. "They came in again yesterday," she told me over coffee, "trying to restart the payments themselves. When we told them they needed your authorization, Sarah actually started crying. Crying. Real tears. She said they'd already put deposits down on new furniture, that they'd told friends they owned the house outright now. Apparently, they'd been spending money they didn't have based on the assumption that you'd be out of the picture. This was news to me. They'd been making financial decisions based on their plan to steal my home. The depth of their presumption was staggering. "There's something else," Jessica said hesitantly. They asked about challenging your mental competency through the courts, and I told them that would require significant evidence and that you'd seemed perfectly sharp every time I'd spoken with you. But Mrs. Carter, if they're serious about that route, let them try, I said. I've been documenting everything. And I have witnesses to their behavior too, but privately, I knew this was escalating beyond simple family drama. They were preparing for war, and I needed to be ready. The family meeting was held at my sister-in-law Margaret's house. Neutral ground, as she called it. Margaret had been Thomas's younger sister, and she'd insisted that the whole family needed to sit down and work this out like civilized people. I almost didn't go, but Megan advised me that showing up would demonstrate my competency and willingness to communicate. Important if this ended up in court. The living room was crowded. Margaret and her husband, Thomas's brother Robert and his wife, 2 cousins, and of course, Andrew and Sarah. They'd arranged the chairs in a circle, like some kind of intervention. Eileen, Margaret began, we're all here because we're concerned about this situation with the house. Andrew has explained what happened, and while we all agree he handled things poorly. Poorly, I interrupted. He slapped me and threw me out of my own home. He was grieving, Robert said. We all do things we regret when we're in pain. Do you research mental competency laws when you're grieving? Robert. The room went quiet. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Margaret frowned. What are you talking about? I opened my purse and pulled out a folder. I'm talking about the fact that Andrew and Sarah have been planning this for months. They didn't just snap after the funeral. They've been systematically working to take control of my property and possibly have me declared incompetent. I handed Margaret a printout. These are emails Sarah sent to her sister discussing their plan for Andrew's mother. Read the date. 3 months before Thomas died. Margaret's face grew pale as she read. Sarah, this email. You're talking about nursing homes and conservatorships. It was just a conversation, Sarah said defensively. We were worried about her living alone. Read the next page, I said. Margaret continued reading, her expression growing more horrified. You researched the legal requirements for having someone declared mentally incompetent. You discussed the timeline for selling the house once you handled the mother situation. The room erupted. Thomas's family began demanding explanations from Andrew and Sarah, who tried to claim they were just being practical, just planning for contingencies. There's more, I said, raising my voice above the chaos. I pulled out another document. This is a consultation agreement with Peterson and Associates, the law firm that specializes in elder law. Sarah signed this 6 weeks before Thomas died. Andrew's Uncle Robert grabbed the paper. You actually hired lawyers to research removing your mother-in-law from her own property. And there's this, I said, producing one final document. A brochure for Sunset Manor Assisted Living, with a handwritten note for Anita's mother, memory care unit. It's in Sarah's handwriting. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone stared at Andrew and Sarah, who could no longer maintain the pretense that this had been a grief-fueled impulse. Margaret set down the papers with shaking hands. Eileen, I had no idea. We thought this was just a misunderstanding after the funeral. It was never a misunderstanding, I said quietly. It was a systematic plan to steal my home and possibly have me committed. The only thing they didn't plan for was me fighting back. Thomas's brother Robert looked directly at Andrew. Your mother helped raise you, boy. She worked double shifts to pay for your college, and this is how you repay her. We were going to take care of her. Andrew started. In a memory care unit. Margaret's voice was ice cold. When there's nothing wrong with her memory, while living in her house and spending her money, I added, yes, Andrew, that was your plan for taking care of me. The family members who had come to mediate were now looking at Andrew and Sarah with disgust and disappointment. The narrative had shifted completely. The court petition arrived 2 weeks later. Andrew and Sarah were challenging my mental competency, requesting a psychological evaluation, and asking for temporary conservatorship over my finances and property, pending determination of Mrs. Carter's ability to manage her affairs. I wasn't surprised, but I was impressed by their audacity. Despite being exposed at the family meeting, despite having their premeditation documented, they were doubling down. Megan was furious. This is exactly what we expected, but it's still outrageous. They have no evidence of mental impairment. They're fishing. What happens now? We fight, and we win. And she spread the court documents across her desk. They've made several mistakes here. First, they've alleged that your decision to suspend mortgage payments demonstrates impaired judgment, but you have clear legal authority to make that decision. Second, they claim your erratic behavior is evidence of cognitive decline, but we have documentation showing you've been systematically protecting yourself from their abuse. The court hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, Megan arranged for me to undergo a comprehensive psychological evaluation with Dr. Patricia Williams, a forensic psychologist who specialized in competency assessments. Dr. Williams was thorough. 3 hours of cognitive tests, memory assessments, and detailed interviews about my decision-making process. When she finished, she looked puzzled. "Mrs. Carter, I have to ask, what prompted your son to request this evaluation? He wants control of my property, and I'm not cooperating." She nodded slowly. "Because based on these results, you're not only competent, you're functioning at a higher cognitive level than most people your age. Your memory is excellent, your reasoning is sound, and your judgment appears to be quite sharp." The hearing itself was almost anticlimactic. Andrew and Sarah's lawyer, a nervous young man who clearly hadn't expected to face such organized opposition, presented their case weakly. They claimed my sudden decision to change my will and suspend mortgage payments showed impaired judgment. They pointed to my isolation from family as evidence of paranoid thinking. Megan destroyed their arguments methodically. She presented Dr. Williams's evaluation, which showed perfect cognitive function. She introduced evidence of Andrew and Sarah's premeditated plan, including the emails, the consultation agreements, and the assisted living brochures. She called Jessica from the bank as a witness to testify about their attempts to bypass my authority as co-owner. But the moment that sealed their fate came when Megan called Mrs. Chen, my landlord, as a witness. "Mrs. Carter has been an ideal tenant," Mrs. Chen testified. "She pays her rent on time, maintains her apartment beautifully, and has even helped other residents with medical questions. When her son came around asking about her mental state, I was confused because she's one of the most capable people I know." "What specifically did her son ask you?" Megan inquired. "He wanted to know if she seemed confused about money, if she'd been acting strangely, if she'd mentioned being afraid or paranoid. When I told him she seemed perfectly fine, he seemed disappointed." The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, had been taking notes throughout. When it came time for her ruling, she was blunt. "This petition appears to be motivated not by genuine concern for Mrs. Carter's welfare, but by frustration with her legal decisions regarding property ownership. The psychological evaluation shows no cognitive impairment. The evidence presented demonstrates that Mrs. Carter has been making rational decisions to protect herself from what appears to be a calculated attempt to circumvent her property rights." She turned to Andrew and Sarah. "Furthermore, the court finds that this petition was filed in bad faith, without proper evidence, and appears to be part of a pattern of elder abuse. The request for conservatorship is denied." Then she did something I hadn't expected. "Mrs. Carter, do you wish to file a counterclaim for elder abuse and harassment?" I looked at Andrew, sitting at the defendant's table with his head in his hands. For a moment, I saw the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard. But then I remembered the slap, the emails, the systematic plan to erase me from my own life. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." The elder abuse finding changed everything. It wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was a legal determination that Andrew and Sarah had engaged in systematic abuse of a vulnerable adult. The implications were immediate and severe. Andrew's employer, a conservative accounting firm, placed him on administrative leave pending review. Sarah's real estate license was suspended while the state board investigated. The local newspaper picked up the story, "Son attempts to steal mother's home through competency challenge." But the real crisis came when Sarah's parents learned about the court ruling. They'd co-signed for Andrew and Sarah's car loans and credit cards, trusting their daughter's claims that they were about to inherit valuable property. When they realized their daughter had been lying about the family's financial situation while accumulating debt, they demanded immediate repayment. Within a week, Andrew and Sarah filed for bankruptcy. 3 days later, Andrew came to see me alone. He looked like he'd aged 10 years, hollow-eyed, thin, wearing clothes that hung loose on his frame. When I opened the door, he didn't try to come in. He just stood in the hallway, staring at his feet. "Mom," he said quietly, "I came to say goodbye. Goodbye." Sarah left, went back to her parents in Phoenix, filed for divorce yesterday. He finally looked up at me. "I lost my job. I'm going to lose the bankruptcy case, too. Turns out what we did to you counts as fraudulent behavior that can't be discharged." I felt a stab of something, not quite sympathy, but the echo of 38 years of motherhood. "Andrew." "I don't want forgiveness," he said quickly. "I don't deserve it. I just wanted to tell you that I understand now. What we did to you. It wasn't grief or stress or any of the excuses I told myself. It was greed. Pure, ugly greed." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "This is from Dad's desk. I found it when I was packing up. He wrote it before he died." I took the envelope. In Thomas's familiar handwriting, "For Eileen, in case our boy forgets how to be decent." "He knew," Andrew said. "Dad knew exactly what kind of person I'd become, and he tried to protect you from me." I felt tears starting, but I blinked them back. "What will you do now?" "I don't know. Start over, I guess. Maybe learn how to be the man you and Dad tried to raise instead of the man I became." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Mom, the house is going to auction next week. I just thought you should know." After he left, I sat with Thomas's letter for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Eileen, you were always stronger than you knew. Don't let anyone make you forget that. Love, T." That evening, I called Megan. "I want to buy the house at auction." I bought the house for 60 cents on the dollar at the foreclosure auction. No one else bid against me. The story had made local news, and everyone knew it was my property to reclaim. But I didn't want to live there anymore. Too many memories, too much pain. Instead, I listed it with a realtor and began planning my next chapter. Alaska had always called to me. Thomas and I had talked about visiting someday, maybe even retiring there. I'd kept in touch with my old nursing school roommate, Patricia, who'd moved to Anchorage 30 years ago and constantly sent pictures of mountains and lakes and endless sky. "You should come," she'd written in her last letter. "There's a whole community of us up here, women who decided to start over later in life. We call ourselves the Second Act Society." The house sold within 2 months to a young family with 3 children. As I signed the papers, I felt nothing but relief. That building had been my prison as much as my home. I used part of the proceeds to buy a small cabin on Lake Lucille, about an hour outside Anchorage. Patricia helped me find it. 2 bedrooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that looked out over water so clear you could see the bottom 20 feet down. The moving process was liberating. I donated most of my furniture to charity, keeping only the pieces that held genuine meaning: Thomas's rocking chair, my grandmother's quilt, the photo albums that told the story of our real life together, not the version Andrew and Sarah had tried to rewrite. Flying into Anchorage on a crisp October morning, I watched the landscape unfold below me, endless wilderness, mountains that touched the sky. a vastness that made my old problems seem very small. Patricia met me at the airport, her gray hair wild from the wind, her smile broader than I remembered. "Welcome to your new life, Eileen," she said, hugging me tight. The cabin was perfect, small enough to manage easily, but comfortable. The previous owners had left it furnished with sturdy, practical pieces that suited the setting. I spent my first week just sitting by the lake, drinking coffee and watching the light change on the water. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone to tell me I was in the way. 3 months into my Alaska life, I was volunteering at the Anchorage Women's Resource Center, helping with intake interviews for women seeking emergency housing. Many of them were my age or older, women whose families had turned against them, who'd been financially abused, who'd been convinced they were burdens. I found myself telling pieces of my story during these sessions, not for sympathy, but to show these women that fighting back was possible, that age didn't mean powerlessness. "You really stood up to them," said Maria, a 70-year-old woman whose daughter had been stealing her Social Security checks. "I always thought I had to just accept whatever my kids decided." "Nobody has the right to abuse you," I told her, "even if they're family, especially if they're family." Word of my story spread through the resource center. The director, Janet Mueller, approached me one afternoon with an unexpected proposition. "Eileen, have you ever considered sharing your story more widely? We've been working with Alaska Public Radio on a series about elder advocacy. They're looking for real voices, real experiences." The radio producer, Tom Weatherby, was a gentleman in his 50s who'd moved to Alaska to escape his own complicated family history. When we met at a coffee shop downtown, he listened to my story with growing amazement. "Mrs. Carter, this isn't just a personal triumph, it's a blueprint. Do you realize how many older adults are facing exactly what you faced? Financial abuse by family members is an epidemic that nobody talks about. What are you suggesting? A podcast. Your voice, your story, but also a platform for other people to share theirs. We could call it the silent revolution or second act stories. Something that captures the idea that it's never too late to take control of your life." I was skeptical at first. Who would want to listen to an old woman talk about family problems? But Tom convinced me to try one episode, just to see how it felt. We recorded it in the tiny studio at the community radio station. I told my story simply, without drama or self-pity. I talked about the signs I'd missed, the legal rights I'd discovered, the importance of documentation and professional help. Most importantly, I talked about the difference between forgiveness and enabling. "Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself," I said into the microphone, "but it doesn't mean you have to let people continue hurting you. You can forgive someone and still protect yourself from them." The episode aired on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, the station had received over 200 emails and phone calls. Women across Alaska, across the country, were reaching out to share their own stories of family financial abuse, elder manipulation, and the struggle to maintain dignity and independence in old age. "You've touched something important," Tom told me. "People need to hear this." The second episode featured Maria from the Resource Center, telling her story of financial abuse and recovery. The third included a retired teacher from Fairbanks who'd discovered her son was forging her signature on loan documents. Within 6 months, Second Act Stories had become one of Alaska Public Radio's most popular programs. 1 year after moving to Alaska, I received an unexpected letter. The return address was from a rehabilitation center in Colorado. Inside, Andrew's handwriting, shaky but recognizable. "Dear Mom, I'm writing from a residential program for people dealing with addiction and mental health issues. Not alcohol or drugs, but what the counselors here call behavioral addictions. Greed, they say, can be just as destructive as any substance. I've been here 4 months, working through what led me to treat you the way I did. The counselors helped me understand that I'd spent years justifying terrible behavior by telling myself I was entitled to things I hadn't earned. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness or to try to rebuild our relationship. I understand that I destroyed any right to that. I'm writing because I learned something I wanted you to know. You were right to fight back. You were right to protect yourself. And you were right that I had become someone unworthy of your love. I heard about your podcast through a friend. I'm proud of what you're doing, proud that my terrible choices led to something that helps other people. That doesn't make what I did right, but it makes me glad that you didn't let it destroy you. I hope you're happy. Mom, I hope Alaska is everything you wanted it to be. Love if I still have the right to sign that way. Andrew, I read the letter 3 times, sitting by my lake as the autumn light faded. It wasn't an apology exactly, and it wasn't a request for reconciliation. It was an acknowledgement of my strength, of his failures, and of the possibility that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone you love is let them face the consequences of their choices. I wrote back, just a few lines, Andrew. I'm glad you're getting help. Recovery from any addiction takes courage. I hope you find peace with yourself. I forgave you long ago, not for your sake, but for mine. Carrying anger was too heavy for my new life. Take care of yourself. Mom, the next morning, I recorded a special episode about forgiveness, boundaries, and the difference between enabling and loving. It became one of our most downloaded shows. The podcast had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. We received letters from adult children who'd recognized their own abusive behavior and sought help, from elderly parents who'd found the courage to set boundaries, from social workers and lawyers who used our episodes as training materials. I'd thought my story was about losing a family and gaining independence. But it turned out to be about losing a toxic relationship and gaining a community. Every week, Patricia and I drove into Anchorage to record new episodes. Sometimes we featured guests, other survivors, legal experts, psychologists. Sometimes it was just me, talking about the practical aspects of starting over at 73, managing finances independently, building new social networks, finding purpose after traditional roles end. You know what I love most about this? Patricia said one afternoon as we walked along the lake shore. You're not just surviving what happened to you, you're using it to help other people survive too. She was right. The woman who'd been slapped and thrown out of her own home had become someone who threw lifelines to others drowning in similar circumstances. I still lived quietly in my lake cabin, still cherished my solitude and independence. But now, my silence had found its voice, and that voice was helping others find theirs. Sometimes, strength isn't about fighting back in the moment. Sometimes it's about enduring until you're in a position to fight effectively. Sometimes the best revenge is living so well that the people who try to diminish you become irrelevant to your happiness. As I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sun set over the lake, I realized I'd finally learned the difference between being quiet and being silenced. I'd spent too many years confusing the two. Now, in the vast silence of the Alaska wilderness, I'd never been louder.